everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for episode 8 of season 2 of Revise and Resubmit. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Boland, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama. And we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA.
You know, Annalisa, when we have interviewed faculty members from the School of Library and Information Studies, and as we've discussed, this doesn't mean that we have faculty who are overseeing library book checkouts or the restocking of books after they've been returned, but I think it's an important reminder. When you think about the second piece of that program, Information Studies, this is where we can get a really interesting look at the information piece of everything we do. Let's think about it. We're always dealing with information. Sometimes correct information, sometimes incorrect information.
You're right. And this is just one of the many things we'll be talking about in this episode with Dr. Lori Benici. We cover so much territory in today's conversation, but one thing that we'll be discussing is informationless behavior. Yep, you heard that right. Okay, so you might ask, what do you mean by informationless behavior? Here's the answer in a context that we can all probably relate to. So in the last year, we've seen so much information online, on social media, and other platforms about the COVID vaccines that are now available to some in the public. And along with this information, we've seen a lot of misinformation. So informationless behavior involves the sharing of information without mentioning the source of that information. And this actually is something that happens all the time, and it leads to this trickle-down effect of misinformation often being shared. And this is something that we take points off for students, right? In assignments. But I'm wondering how often I share information without mentioning the source. And I don't want to be informationless anymore.
As we'll hear from today's guest, information is not information without human communication. And by that, she means we all play a role in the information that is developed, created, and shared. With that, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Lori Benici, an Associate Professor in the School of Library and Information Studies. Welcome, Lori. Thanks so much for joining us today, Lori.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, before we dive into your research a little bit, we were doing a little bit of social media stalking, and we saw that your bio on Twitter indicates that you are an outdoor adventurer. And we were wondering if you could tell our listeners about maybe a favorite outdoor adventure you've had.
Oh gosh, that's hard because I've had several.
So many.
Yeah. Well, probably one of the more interesting ones I had down in Florida. There's a little place. It's about a 3-mile little circle, which doesn't sound like much of an adventure, 3 miles, but I was out with a group of people. We're riding along this thing. It's out in the Everglades, and somebody says, "Gator." And so I stop and I put my foot down, and I'm looking around. I don't see anything. And I turn and I look at them, like a group of 3 of them looking at me, and I go, "Where?" And they're like about 2 feet from your leg. Of course, I'm looking out, right? And I look down, I'm like, oh, wow. I just calmly put my foot back on the bike and pedaled away. I'm like, you could have let me know just how close it was. But close encounters. But yeah, that'll get your day going. And then it can make you ride your bike faster.
That's hilarious. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I feel like I would not know what to do, and that would be terrifying.
Well, there's nothing to do but leave.
Yes. fighting and
Well,
flighting
they
right
used to
there.
say those had no predator. They're like the king of the Everglades, but now we have pythons in the Everglades that kill gators. So, maybe at that moment I would have wanted a python. I don't know.
Oh, that's sort of making me not want to go to the Everglades, though.
Oh, but
Right.
you should. It's one of the last beautiful, really natural places that, affects our entire world ecosystem. It's a really interesting place if you ever get a chance, despite the alligators and the pythons.
And the pythons. Right.
Just don't go bye.
So, so Lori, can you tell us and our listeners briefly about who you are and where you're from?
Okay. Well, I am a associate professor in the School of Library and Information Studies, of course, in the College of Communication Information Sciences. I consider myself first and foremost as a researcher, but I enjoy teaching, of course. And I'm originally from Indiana, born and raised. But if people kind of ask me where I'm from now, I say Florida because I lived in Florida for quite a while, got my PhD at Florida State, and then took a bit of a path around and then ended up at Alabama.
So could you give us an elevator pitch on your research?
Sure. First and foremost, I consider myself a researcher, like I said before, but a information theorist. There's not a lot of information theory, so that's kind of my thing. I like looking at developing theory. I'm a social and behavioral researcher interested in socio-technical aspects of information. So what are the human behaviors with information technology? And I think that's just fascinating because computers are just computers and systems are just systems. It's people that make them interesting.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. I like that a lot.
Well, and I'm going to, so you basically gave us a headline right there that computers are computers and it's people that make things interesting. And can you tell us a little bit more about one of your findings related to that?
Well, yeah, actually, it's a recent one. I do research with a colleague at Emporia State University, and she does a lot of things in the area of medical information. But where we come together is in everyday information seeking. So think about if you had a diagnosis, and you walk out of the doctor's office and you get all this medical mumbo jumbo, and you just want to know, what is my life going to be like? Because that's really what it's about. How do I live with this every day? So one of the areas we look at is vaccine, which is really exciting right now, right? Yeah. It's going to be interesting. So we wrapped up a project looking prior to the COVID situation because we thought that would set a little less tumultuous base. And one of the things we came up that was interesting is what we call, and this seems odd for a field and where we look at information, but it's called informationless behavior. So basically what it is when people share information, but they never say anything about where they heard it, where it came from, what the source is. And when you're in a forum discussing something, you think that would be important. Yep. But you know what? On both sides of the vaccine issue, they do this. But then they turn around and accuse each other of doing it without realizing they do it themselves. So a good chunk of this conversation is this stuff thrown out, and then they sit around and debate how people behave around information and communicating information. And there's very little about vaccine itself. You really have to cull that vaccine information out. So we call it informationless behavior. Like I said, humans are what make it interesting.
Yeah. Well, so then I have to ask, how did you get started doing this type of research?
Okay. So that's interesting. Out of the program I did my PhD in at Florida State, everyday information seeking was a big thing. My major professor, Elfrida Chapman, that was really her deal and her thing. And that's what she got her students into, which really, fits a lot of information situations. Is okay, we have these formal situations, but really what do we do every day for everyday people? So I happened to go back to Florida State and do a visiting lecture there. And in that process, I reconnected with a person who was doing a postdoc who I had known for a while, but kind of fell out of touch with. Well, she happened to drive me to the airport and was letting me kind of know what was going on with her life and what she was doing, and what she was looking at with vaccines. And we just kind of said, I said, hey, I'd be really interested in looking at that with you. So at the time she went out to Emporia, she had landed a job there, headed out there. And of course, that, we all know that's never easy, starting somewhere where you're new. And so we just established, she sent me a paper and said, hey, would you read over this before I submit it? And I read it. And then from there, it just kind of grew. And so it's been a really interesting, professional collaboration, but also really good social support. And I like working with my colleagues at Alabama, but there's something about collaborating with somebody on the outside that keeps you kind of in check,
Yes.
So
accountable.
Well, yeah, and I actually have there's two researchers I do that with, but that's how we connected. And we do we do a Pomodoro timer sessions every Monday for our research. And we do like 4 hours. We start at 1 p.m. We set a timer for, we kind of visit and catch up on each other for about 10 minutes. And then we set a 20-minute timer. We work for 20 minutes. We talk about what we're going to do. We work for 20 minutes, and then we stop and break for 10 minutes and kind of update. Well, what did you do? What did you do? Okay, da, 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 da. And then we do another 20 minutes, and we do this for about 4 hours. And when we're working toward publication, we've been known to do it for 6. We'll end at 4 hours and go, do you want to keep going, or do you, should we quit? And I'm like, hey, we're on a roll. Let's keep going.
That's really cool. And I want to to
okay.
Exactly.
Actually, it's a really good process. It's something the ICR could do and be really great to bring doc students. And you can do it live. You can do it by Zoom, or when we can all get together, you can do it live, have people gather in a room. I did this on a visiting professorship in Toronto with a group of people at Ryerson, and said, wow, this really works. So productivity.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you for this new idea.
And then I'll tell you about how I work with my other collaborator, because that's a whole opposite thing.
Well, yes.
Well, he actually is a videographer. That's what he's been in. And then before he went into information science, and now he does visual information. And I'm working on a book with him, which kind of got put off with the whole COVID thing. We've been kind of derailed, but the way he works is in snippets. So we'll lay out what our topic areas are. And then what you do is like a 1 or 2 page brief on it. And then you share that and you develop it. So it becomes like maybe 5, 6 pages, 10 pages. And I said, well, what do we do with all this? And he said, well, it's like snippets of video where you snip and edit and move something over here. Or you might move something that was way at the end toward the beginning or part of it. And you just kind of chop it up and assemble it. And I'm like, yeah, totally. Because I'm very linear, oddly, in my thinking. So this has been a real kind of turn it on the ear, but it's working. And it really helps you be productive with a large topic like a book, to break it down like that and do it. So again, totally opposite of what I'm doing with my co-researcher at Emporia. But it really, you think you're done learning and you never are. Yeah.
So true.
So Laura, you've mentioned that you work with a videographer on some research and a book project, and then you are doing the vaccine study, but you're a library researcher. So
are we really going to go down that path?
How do you manage this intertwining of disciplines?
Well, it's interesting you say that. It really isn't. Information and libraries are pretty much inextricable anymore. It used to be you went to the library to get a book and check it out and read it, right? And you look now, and information is all around us. Whether it's formal resources that we're pulling from, a library's website, say through Scout, at the University of Alabama, or whether it's somebody sharing their experience. Go back to that everyday information seeking thing and a medical issue. that person sharing that in a private group, maybe on Facebook, is highly valuable, and that is information. Am I a librarian? I was once a systems librarian before I went to get a PhD. And so I set up the systems for a library, and it was actually my director in that job, because they made me float to the reference desk, and I hated that. God, I hated that. Because, I never knew what was going on. They'd shift the stacks, and I'm like, I don't know where anything is. And, my director said, one day, she goes, you need to go get a PhD. And I said, why? She goes, you ask more questions at the reference desk than you answer. Oh, well, okay. So, information is integral and central to libraries. It's the bigger thing. And so, that's one of the things we say, those of us in the library field, is you can't just call it library research, because we do way more than libraries. Sometimes my research touches on libraries, but most of the time it's really just information. And how that happened? What happened was, post-World War II, the coders, the people who come out of computer science who were coders, went back into academia, went back to their departments, and realized they didn't fit anymore, because they had a very human aspect to information, and they felt incredibly lost. They didn't belong. They kind of fractalized off from computer science and said, where do we go? And administrators were like, oh, what do we do with you people? And don't tell Dean Nelson that. And so they said, you know what, we're going to put you in with libraries, because they just are kind of floundering in academia. But we kind of see this connection. And so they put them in library science programs and turn them to library and information science. And, it's been that kind of ongoing, are we library, are we information? And I have always kind of walked between. That's just everything I do. It seems like I have a foot here, foot there. Like my latest research is really borrowing off of communication. And so I'm an information researcher, is really what it is.
Well, so I would like to go there, and you've already addressed this a little bit, but just so that we can clarify this more for our listeners, can you tell our listeners more about kind of the teaching side to what you do? Because when you hear library and information studies, I think that we hear library and we don't necessarily hear the information part, and you've answered that really well, but you're not teaching your students how to work at a reference desk. So and this is casting a very wide net, but what do people in, your school, what types of classes do you teach, and what do students learn?
Well, that's interesting. We just revised a core course. It used to be, I really taught, when I came to Alabama, geez, how long has that been now? I picked up this history of kind of technology course. And I thought, who cares about the history? You can't do anything with that. So I turned it into a productive technology course where you learned web pages and databases and stuff like that. And then recently, Dr. Elmborg is really, and I appreciate this because this is really what I came out of, moving us toward an information science track. And so we've redone the core course and teaching information science. And that's been a really great thing this semester. As a matter of fact, I was just grading final projects before we connected. So it's really teaching students who are coming, and I think a lot of people come to University of Alabama SLIS thinking they're librarians and that's what they're going to do. We have a handful that know the information piece. So now they're getting this solid, what is information science? What does information mean? How do you define it? What is it? And then we get into at some point in the semester, are information and libraries the same? Can you work in a library with an information science concentration? So that's an interesting, has turned out to be a surprisingly interesting course. Other courses I teach are, I teach probably my favorite. Can I start with my favorite? Or should I put that at the end?
Yes, of course.
So I do a human behavior course on cybersecurity. And
Oh,
yeah, it's a
wow.
really,
Wow.
I've taught it in the May semester, and I actually now I'm thinking of keeping it in the May semester. So it's the only thing I'm teaching at that time because it's really intense. And, honestly, I have to tell you, it's been a great success. From what I understand, the students who are in their Facebook group, like, I know I'll hear it again. A student will come to me this spring and go, "Oh, I want to sign up for your course this summer." It gets rave reviews, which, I like because you never know. You never know what they're talking about. But students take that course and we really delve into what's happening in not, how do you keep somebody from hacking your system? It's not necessarily about that. It's not how do you hack a system, although they do learn that. So they see how simple it is. But it's really what goes on. What are the fallouts from this for people and people in organizations? I have them go look at a cybersecurity map. So it's a live map you go to and you see where the potential attacks and the attacks are happening, from what country to what company, what the bounce throughs are. Yeah, really, really super interesting. But what I find, and I'm finding this more and more, and I don't know what will happen this May, some students actually get to the point in that course about midway, which is 2 weeks, really disturbed, like almost on a meltdown situation. I've had a couple that are like that because they're like, I don't know what to believe anymore, who to trust, what to do. And I'm like, okay, which is good. They learn this because they will deal with people doing that. So that's a fun course. And at the end, it's really interesting because they use their cell phone and they learn how to hack something. Yeah.
Oh,
We even do a little exercise. It was hard this last May because of quarantine, but usually I have them go out in public and sit somewhere and just hone in on a person and just see them from a distance, don't hear them or anything, and see if they can figure out something about this person and figure out who they are. And you'd be surprised. Well, think about it. If I walk down the street with a shirt that says Roll Tide, now you got to start. Right. You get a start and then you go, okay, well, what if I'm on vacation somewhere and I'm doing that? Right. And so they come down and it's really interesting what they whether they truly figure it out or not is interesting, but what they come up with and what they can find out. I mean, you can snap a picture of this person. I never tell them to, but I've had people do that. It's like, wow, okay. But then they do get into the privacy issues on that. How it made them feel, but how they realize they can be a victim of that. So that's a course. I teach social media and informatics. There's a word for you, informatics. Yeah, it's a little bit about what we've been talking about, but it's more of a systematic study. It's not just the human behavior, it's the data involved with information. And then, gosh, what else do I teach? Oh, right now I'm teaching a social media for social justice course. This has turned out really, it's the first time offering it and it's really been interesting. I think that's another one that's been emotionally taxing over a 16-week period. Students take on, I asked them at the beginning of the course, okay, I want you to pick a social justice passion you're interested in, but I also want you to identify a social justice issue in the community where you live, because, we have an online program, right? So people are all over the place. In a few instances that overlapped, like Black Lives Matter. But for a lot of them, it was different and there were some kind of offbeat things. And so they went through this and they went through steps all semester of how to promote their cause on social media. But they also had to look at the opposing side to their cause, who was, fighting against it. And that kind of hit around midterm, which, was interesting. But I had a guy from Texas. Now get this, a guy from Texas, from backwoods Texas. So we're talking, you can kind of get an idea here. And he went off to undergrad in the Northeast and realized, wow, the whole world doesn't think like backwoods Texas. Now I've lived in Texas, so I'm getting this. Anyway, he brought up his social justice passion was male toxicity, which was a new thing to me. And they had to explain it, right? They had to give a little spiel and explain what their passion was and what this cause is and define it and, introduce it to their colleagues. And he talked about a Gillette commercial, I think back a few years ago, of these men in Iceland. And so Gillette, it was really interesting because as an outcome of this commercial of these men talking about how just what their presence has done in the world did two things. It increased the sales of Gillette for, of course, Iceland and a few countries, but the sales went down in the United States because, men didn't want to know that some of the problems they've created in the world. So that, it was interesting to have a man in the class take that on. Incredibly interesting. Mm-hmm. So as an outcome, they're learning how to use and promote a cause through legitimate information on social media. Yeah, it's fun. So none of those are about libraries.
Yeah.
We have library students in there who, go, okay, I want to know how to do this. So when I'm in my public library in a particular community, they can promote that cause, right, through social media channel for their library. But this is not about libraries.
Mm-hmm. I'm getting so many ideas myself.
I know. That's why we do this kind of stuff, right? We have conversations. Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly right.
So, Lori, I want to ask you, because this is something that I saw on your Google Scholar page, and something that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. You mentioned that you build theory. And don't we have enough theory out there? Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what that means, grounded theory, and what it means to be a scholar who is really developing?
Okay, that's so theory. It's interesting you say, don't we have enough theory? In communication, you guys have a lot of theory. And I think that's an area where we could strengthen ties between communication and information. I mean, to me, communication and information are inextricably linked. I mean, what are you communicating if you're not communicating information? And what is information if it doesn't get communicated? It's just stored somewhere, right? So I think that there's a lot. And as a matter of fact, I'm in the process right now of borrowing from a communication theory to develop an information theory. But I'll get to that in a minute. So I'll go back to Elfrida Chapman, my dissertation advisor. She was the premier theorist in our field. And as she said to me back in my doctoral days, as she goes, so many people don't get what I do. She would have journal things, turned down all the time because people didn't understand what she did. She came out of Berkeley, which kind of explains it right there. But she really taught me what it means, that your dissertation isn't about a topic. It's about testing theory, testing and revising theory. And that just really fascinated me and worked well for me because, if I did something with technology, it would be outdated very quickly. So she said to me, I said, someday I'm going to develop a theory about technology, because she was a Luddite. And she'd laugh and go, yeah. But she'd talk about how long it would take till you really got to your first theory, which she was an associate professor by the time that happened. And ironically, so was I. And actually, this is really interesting because so many of the people we recruit into the PhD concentration tend to be library. They don't really, we're seeing more information science. But so I was invited to work with a student out at Emporia. There's that connection. And I essentially chaired her dissertation because nobody knew what she was doing at Emporia because they have probably even more of a library focused program than we do at Alabama. But she used a emerging theory of mine called Kafki's. And it looks at basically looking at how you can determine when information in a social media channel is legitimate. So an example, she was working with weather. Okay, so she's working with these, what they call on the ground reporters for weather, because they have, tons of tornadoes out there like we do in Alabama. And so she took the elements from my theory on how you determine if information is credible and legitimate. And she worked with a group out in Wichita that, are meteorologists. It's a team of people that work together, and how they decide what information they take off of social media to turn around and report through the official media channel to the public. And that was a really interesting dissertation, because, you have things like images, right? So like I said to her, well, could I have taken an image in Alabama of a tornado, turn around a year later, visit it out in Kansas, and when I'm out there, just post this picture and say, hey, there's a tornado out here. And somebody would look at my location service and go, oh, look at that. When there really wasn't. It was Alabama. So that became the question of, well, how do they look at images to determine, is that legit? Right? That's just an example.
Yeah.
So she's been working with that theory. I continue to work with that theory, looking at reviews online when people review services. So like my big thing is veterinary, how people who move to, say, a new place, don't know anybody, need to find a veterinarian, or go into a crisis mode of, of their own health issue, like a tooth, needing a root canal or whatever. How do they find out? And a lot of people turn now to social media for that, right? But how do they know who to trust? Because they're in what we would call an information desert, of I don't know anybody. And a lot of that kind of information is who you know, how you know to trust, and what the connections are with that. So I continue to work with that theory, but the latest one comes out of this informationless behavior project I did earlier. We used, and I know you guys must know about this, communication acts, right? So the 3 different kinds of acts that people have with communication. And so we analyzed the data looking at this, and then we realized, as we looked at the data, we're like, so think about the information-less behavior, and not verifying the information, or not providing where you found it, or was it your experience, or, who was it? And we think there are information acts. And people, okay, so an example that's really obvious that we're not talking about is misinformation and disinformation, right? Disinformation is purposeful, intended to throw the person off track. Misinformation is just people who don't know and throw stuff out. And there might be a little bit of misinformation going on in this VAX forum, but we are thinking, so many of people in information science think of information as a thing, something we store, something we retrieve, something we use, when really in today's age, it's something that's being communicated. And it's how that's being communicated. Right? So you have a combination of content and the method by which it's communicated, and what goes on around right before and right after that makes the scene of, will somebody trust this or not? Will somebody take up this information and use it or not? So we're right in the process right now, because we just published the other article, put it out for publication. So we're just now coming together and structuring this kind of seed theory on Information Act. We're excited. We're
That's
excited
really
about
cool.
it. I think it's really timely. So we'll see. But I kind of, as we looked at it, what occurred to me, and I'd like to share this with you guys. I feel like there's this chasm. There's communication, and there's information. And I kind of think of it in the structure at Alabama. You guys are over there at Pfeiffer, we're over there at Gorgas, and then there's this like big place between, right? That negates proximity. But then there's this understanding, aren't you people library thing, right? What's like, okay, what are you doing over there? But I think that it also, that area between like the quad and all that, there's a metaphoric piece there that exists probably in any communication and information program. There's communication there, like you talked about, there's these disciplines. And I feel like Information Act falls right in the middle. Remember, I told you I always have my feet too in one place or the other, so I end up kind of with if I can keep standing up, it's somewhere in between. And I feel like this is that. As a matter of fact, when we submit this one for publication, we will definitively recommend people in the communication discipline for review. I think that's super important that, I think people in the information area will get it. They may or may not agree with it, but they'll understand it. But the question becomes, what will the communication science people think? So maybe I'll throw it by you before we send it out.
Yeah.
Of course.
Well, So shifting gears just a little bit, as I told you, we wanted to wrap this up on a little bit of a fun note. As academics, we have the very good fortune of being able to travel to different countries or different cities to present our research and to talk to others about our research. So can you tell us one of the favorite places you visited while presenting research, or a place that you're kind of looking forward to visiting?
I've traveled quite a bit for conferences, and I have a lot of fun things. And I always make it a point to try to combine and do something fun when I visit somewhere. But probably the one that sticks out to me is Valencia, Spain. Well, you know what I liked is it kind of had that tropical thing going on, and I needed to get out of the Alabama winter thing. But it's a big area for cycling, and I'm a big cyclist. So that's a very popular area for cycling. Mm-hmm. And I only took like one day right before I left that afternoon when the conference ended and rented a bike. And unfortunately, it wasn't a road bike. It was something else. But I rode around, and, you know, it was right on the coast. So that was beautiful. But I'll tell you what was really interesting. So each day, you know, they have a siesta time. So, you know, there's no conference stuff going on. Mm. So I would go out and jog. And most things were closed, but occasionally you would pick up a restaurant owner or somebody that was out. And I would ask them, where do you eat? Where do you eat when you go out with your family? And so I really went off the beaten path and discovered a lot of great dishes because I enjoy cooking. So I experienced that part of it, the real people side. But what was really interesting combined with my profession was, so it was the International Society of Knowledge Organization, ISCO, was the conference I was presenting at. And so it was kind of like being at the UN. You're up there, you're presenting in English, right? But they're translating it into Spanish. Now, I'm fluent in Spanish.
Wow.
And this became really difficult for me because I'm saying something in English and I'm hearing it go on in Spanish, right? It's because you have these headphones on. And finally, in the middle of the presentation, I could not do it anymore. And I'm sure I was like stammering. And finally, I took it off and I said, can I just present this thing in Spanish? And they all looked and that's what I did. I took my slides and and it was like, awesome. But then I realized presenting in Spanish is like, wow, you know, because part of it was throwing me is when they were translating it, I don't think the translation totally connected. You know, there's much to be lost in translation. But that was a really fun place to visit. People were just so nice. That whole Mediterranean area was really cool. And if ISCO ever happens again, I would definitely put in. Did you that one again? I recommend anybody else do it too.
Perfect. Well, Lori, it has been a true pleasure getting to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing with our listeners more about who you are and what you do, and really breaking down information studies.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. So I always enjoy chatting with my colleagues over in communications. It's always refreshing, and I hope that this new work I'm doing brings me over that way a little bit more. Thank you. Good talking to you.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you.